I'm Matthew Buckley Smith, and you're listening to SLEERICKETS, a podcast about poetry and other intractable problems. For this week's episode, I fucked up. I think I really fucked up. I spoke with Elijah Perseus Blumov of Versecraft, familiar to most, if not all of you, and Paul Franz, editor of Literary Imagination, co-editor of Romanticon on Substack, and co-editor, I believe as well, as he mentioned, of a print publication called Serpent Club, although there are a couple other things with that name online. Paul is a really, really smart guy, as you will hear. Elijah set up the whole conversation. They had a little bit of correspondence beforehand. I think they met at the ALSCW conference. Literary Imagination is, of course, the print journal of the ALSCW, in contrast to Literary Matters, the online journal. Literary Imagination is also the darling of the association, and Literary Matters is the red-headed stepchild. But all that aside, Elijah very generously and enthusiastically teed up this conversation, and we all corresponded some. We exchanged some ideas for essays we might read and talk about. We were kind of going to focus on Romanticon, which is this big Substack collaborative venture among a handful of self-styled neo-romantics online. So in retrospect, this should have just been a conversation between Elijah and Paul. They are both very smart. They're both very learned. They both seem to have something of a shared wavelength. And I think what ended up happening is I fucked it up by being present at all. We spoke for almost 3 hours. When I finished the conversation, my very, very strong impression was that I had seldom in recent memory been so palpably disliked by another human being. And I don't know if that's fair at all to Paul. I think he's, he may be a little bit more of a closed book than that. And he and Elijah and I have traded a few emails since then. So I don't know that that's accurate, but it was a difficult interview. And I think it's partly because it wasn't an interview, because I'm not an interviewer. I have these sort of silly, irreverent, rambling, circuitous conversations. And what was really called for, I think, was an interview. So this is a two-parter. I will say this. I may be a bad interviewer, but I am an excellent editor. And I took again, I think mostly to my discredit, a very painful 3-hour interview. And boy, I shaved that thing down to a slick, streamlined 2 hours. You are going to get the smoothest, least filled version of this conversation possible. Unfortunately, you will still probably sense an irreconcilable tension between Paul's great learnedness and my great assholery. But I think, between him and Elijah, there's some decent conversation. They really got on a roll, and then toward the end of the main feed episode, I fuck it up again before going into the secret show, where Paul and I learn about some shared literary enthusiasms, and yet I still don't feel like I still alienate him again and again and again. So apologies to Paul, to all of you, to Elijah especially. Honestly, Elijah, I think maybe you should expand your Versecraft interview series, because I think this called for a much more straightforward, much more dignified sort of academic interview. And I am sadly incapable of providing that, or apparently even hosting it. So this was my fuck up all around. One other thing I thought I would just say as a note, because we spend a fair amount of time in the main feed episode attempting to define romanticism, or, God help us, new romanticism, neo-romanticism. I don't know that we ever quite do it, so I will just tell you, maybe just for the purposes of having a sense of where I was coming from, my own dumb definition. So I think 0 scholars out of 100 would sign on to this definition. But my working understanding of Romanticism to this point has been as follows. The Romantic worldview is best understood in contrast to the classical worldview. What is the classical worldview? What is the worldview of the Greeks and to some degree the Romans? The classical worldview states that what is good, right? If you're gonna evaluate things, which is what both of these worldviews basically do, they evaluate. They're not just descriptive; they're prescriptive. What is good? The classical worldview has one set of answers. The Romantic worldview has another. The classical worldview says that what is good is what is obviously good, right? This is what the Greeks would say. What's good? Well, beauty is good. Strength is good. Power is good. Victory is good. Wealth is good. Youth is good. Sunlight is good. Having is better than not having. Victory is better than defeat. Sex is better than slavery. All of the things that are obviously good are good. The Romantic worldview doesn't precisely turn that on its head, though I do think that like the Nietzschean distinction between the master morality and slave morality has at least some parallelism to this dichotomy. The Romantic worldview, by contrast, just says what is good is what is good for the story. What is good is what makes for a better story. A little bit of intrigue, a little bit of anguish, a little bit of failure, moonlight over sunlight, unrequited love versus requited love, revenge versus comfortable victory. What is good is the gnashing of teeth and the composition of a thrilling soliloquy. Now, what story are we talking about? Well, this is where my completely harebrained love of etymology comes in, because I read romantic as referring chiefly to the roman. What is a roman? Roman is the French word for novel, and traditionally a roman is a chivalric tale, a French saga, a poem telling a story of knights and ladies. A roman is a fairy tale. And when one lives inside a roman, which is, I think, what the Romantic worldview basically think, like the Romantic worldview basically says what we're doing here is not just for our own immediate experience, we're doing it for the sake of the story we're living. We are living in a saga. We are living with an implicit audience. And so what is a good story without some juicy conflict, without some longing from a distance, without some suffering to occasion good poetry? So I think the Romantic worldview, I would say that I think like part of what is sort of exciting about the tension, just the narrative tension of the emergence of Christianity, is that you have basically like a high classical vision of things in Augustus versus a high romantic vision of things in Jesus. Christianity is the supreme romanticism. I would say if you want to look for like a romantic versus a classical slogan, you would go for the classical slogan, you would go to the Odyssey. And in Robert Fitzgerald's version, Odysseus speaks to Achilles, and Achilles says, Odysseus basically praises Achilles, says like, hey, you're the most famous dead guy here. And Achilles says, better I say to break sod as a farmhand for some poor countryman on iron rations than lord it over all the exhausted dead. Achilles says, it is better to be a slave among the living than a king among the dead. That's the quintessential classical wisdom. Any life is better than the best death. Right? Because life is better than death, obviously. Because obviously it's better. What is a quintessential romantic slogan? I'd go to Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. He's a poet. He likes music. There may be music playing while he's composing this, or at least he's thinking about music he's heard. But what he's writing about is an urn that depicts a pipe player. And he says, man, the music I imagine him playing is the sweetest music of all. That's pure romanticism. So I think it's easy to say in this scheme that the classical worldview is wise and the romantic worldview is foolish. And I think there's truth to that. But I also think that without both, you really lose art. I think that art has a limited value in the truly classical worldview. And by classical, I don't mean everybody in ancient Greece thought this way, or there was only one pole to this during a given period in history. I just mean that this is how I have thought about it, as these two tensions in human impulse. And I think most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, contain some of both. And I think that when art entirely gives itself over to the romantic impulse or the romantic worldview, it tends to get a little bit slack and sappy. And when it entirely gives itself over to the classical worldview, it tends to stop being art, for one thing. I am certainly romantic, and that may be why I find myself tugging against it a little bit more ferociously than I might otherwise, because I recognize that impulse in myself to assign value according to what is good for the story. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. One final contrasting example, I would say that if you want the classical worldview's vision of a romantic, you get Don Quixote. And if you want the romantic worldview's vision of a classical man, you get something like Ebenezer Scrooge, right? Those are the imbalanced extremes. Don Quixote is living entirely for an imaginary story, and Ebenezer Scrooge has so much assimilated the idea that what is good is what is obviously good, that all he's doing is piling up money, which at this point is basically worthless to him. So neither of those is necessarily a fair depiction, but I think that might give you some idea of the poles of the classical and the romantic impulse or worldview, as I have previously, and as we will learn, very mistakenly understood them to be. It is better to be a king among the living than a slave among the dead. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Here again is Paul Franz, extremely smart, extremely well-informed, extremely well-read, editor of Literary Imagination, Serpent Club, and Romanticon. And here is Elijah Perseus Blumov, who does a much better job than I do of attempting to interview Paul. I think if we can say one thing with certainty, it is that over the course of the 3 hours that this conversation originally took, neither of us ever quite succeeded in asking Paul the right question.
But yeah, Romanticon makes a somewhat more specific claim. It asserts that the new is in some way allied with the romantic, though in point of fact, we define the romantic broadly and differently. I would say the different editors have slightly different emphases. So there again, there's this silly notion that everybody's invokes Wittgenstein and the family resemblance. I think it's a little overplayed, but there's maybe more of a family resemblance among the items in Romanticon than any single factor they all share.
Sure. What's your definition of romanticism?
My definition of romanticism, maybe there's two questions. What is my definition of romanticism? What is my definition of neo-romanticism?
Oh, sure.
I think,
yeah.
And maybe the
latter. I was trying to explain
is
what
more,
romanticism is to my daughter, and I'm not sure I made any progress.
Yeah, I mean they're related. I would say for neo-romanticism, my standard answer is that it's literature which makes some claim for the importance of the soul. That there's some sense of investment in the soul, that each of us has a life that's somehow entrusted to us. It's a possession of great price, the pearl of great price. Though I would say it's a non-doctrinal interpretation of the soul. I think that there's been much interesting conversation online in and around Romanticon about whether Romanticism is allied in some way with more doctrinal religious forms.
I can feel the new theists trying to bring you in. Their warm, sweaty arms are reaching around you.
Yeah, I mean the most interesting writing along these lines is a fellow called Andrew Kuiper, who's written for us twice. Most recently with an essay on Byron's Luciferian reading of the Bible, where Andrew, who writes under the alias Naucratic, expeditions, claims Byron as a kind of origin-like figure, who's not a kind of mere atheist, but whose atheism, if it is atheism, is a kind of moral protest against against a religion that doesn't believe in universal salvation. So that's a kind of interesting argument. So Andrew is always trying to claim the Romantics as more or less Orthodox Christians. Even Byron is somehow brought indirectly back into the fold. I find that I'm resistant to that. I think even just as a historical matter, I think Wordsworth and Coleridge do have later turns to more Orthodox religion, but their greatest work tends to be written beforehand. There's interest in a natural piety, which has cultural affiliations with Christianity, but to me feels distinct. And I would say other Romantic writers, Shelley and Keats, I think are clearly not doctrinally Christian, but are nonetheless interested in the soul. So I would say the Romantic for me is a kind of, maybe reluctant to say secular, but it's a kind of natural piety that is interested in the self, but is not the sort of trivialized literature of the self we've become quite familiar with. It's not mere confessionalism. The self has some deeper quality, has some eternal quality to it.
But this is when you talk about the soul, you do mean then not just the Greek psyche, but you mean, if not a Christian immortal soul, you mean some sort of immortal entity.
Yeah, something like that. Something like that. I think
Okay.
so.
Yeah, and surely, because
All right.
surely, if you were just talking
I
about
feel comfortably
soulfulness,
excluded then in that case. Sorry, go ahead, Elijah.
I was going to say if you're just talking about soulfulness, then you would have to say that every great literature is romantic, right? Because I mean every great work or period of literature is going to respond to the soul, is going to talk about the soul or the matters of the soul, right? So there has to be something that's a little bit more specific than that, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, that seems right. That the specific thing is that there is an immortal soul is not what I expected. But I'm glad to have a little
I would
clarity.
add to that. I think it's a reaction against kind of technological modernity. There's
Yeah, 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 yeah.
a particular kind of climate of opinion or experience that seems to exclude consideration of the soul, and it's the reclamation of the soul in that
Sure, sure, sure. Yeah.
context.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Well,
yeah.
So
yeah,
I
and
think there's, at least in my own case, there's a strong semi-Luddite element in my
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean
neo-romanticism.
that comes through. I was just rereading your essay, why we need a new romanticism because modernity is ugly, and there's as you say, there's sort of strong vitalist streaks and Luddite streaks in it, as well
Right.
as some other concerns.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
well, it's interesting because we normally associate humanism with classicism, but it seems like you're almost defining a kind of humanism in contrast to the mechanization and the elimination of the human that is, current in our zeitgeist. Would you say that your romanticism is a humanism or not so much?
Would I say that my romanticism is humanism as opposed to what? What's the contrary term? As opposed to a kind of
Well,
Oh,
I mean, the thing
post-humanism seems to be one common rival. Or what do you mean?
or transhumanism. I
yeah,
mean,
I mean, it could be a postmodernism where we believe we can't know anything, and humans have pretty dismal possibilities of knowing the world and of being anything. It could be a medieval anti-humanism that believes that human beings are worms before God, right? So yeah, I think there's a lot of ways to orient oneself that does not focus so much on the human, but it seems like this form of neo-romanticism, responding as it does to an evil technocracy which seeks to eliminate the individual, is focused on the renewal and dignity of not only the individual, which I think romanticism is always big on, the individual, but also just human possibility, human potential, human greatness.
Yeah, I would sign on to that. I would define my own romanticism or neo-romanticism, or at least my interest in the romantic in those terms. That sounds right to me.
And yeah, I was curious. You mentioned it outright that you and your fellow editors have certain different interpretations of romanticism, and you said earlier that Anthony has a romanticism of a different stripe. How would you, just sort of in broad strokes, characterize the differences and the consensus among the four of you?
Okay, with the caveat that I'm reluctant to speak for my fellow editors, and
No, no, no. I
don't want
definitely I don't want you to speak for
Yeah, I
them.
mean,
Just
I would
maybe
say,
your
I would say in
just
impression.
general, I mean,
offer
I
a
think that,
characterization. Yeah,
Yeah.
offer
yeah,
some
I would
account
say,
of the
yeah,
family
I mean, I would say in general,
resemblance.
as a question of emphasis, as a matter of emphasis, I'd say that Anthony is a committed eco-socialist. Anthony is an eco-romanticist. Anthony's interest in romanticism, largely is invested in a romantic conception of nature, but a kind of, panentheistic conception of nature. The nature is divine, though I think nature is also Anthony is also interested in a divinity that exceeds nature. So it's not just pantheist, but panentheist. I would say, and I think Samantha may have somewhat similar interest in the romantic, that she's also quite drawn to Herderian notions of language, which I
Sorry,
think she
sorry,
reads partly.
Herder?
Yeah,
Herder, German philosopher Herder, who she reads, I think, in part through Charles Taylor,
Okay.
who is interested in a constitutive force of language giving rise to concepts which can then take on some material existence. It might be worth noting that Samantha, by her profession, by her day job, is an architect, and so this interest in the literally form-taking properties of the imagination, including as embodied in language, is an important emphasis for her. I think Matthew is interested in Harold Bloom, the tradition of poetic greatness, literary and poetic greatness as a kind of testing ground of the soul. I think in many ways I'm most sympathetic to the latter view.
yeah. I've sort of picked up that Harold Bloom is a big influence for neo-romanticism or new romanticism in general, as is German idealism, which makes sense because German idealism is at the root of the original romantic movement. But it seems like it's receiving an emphasis now that it hasn't for a very long time. Like
Mm.
I did not expect to get on Substack, whatever, a year and a half ago, and see so many people talking about shelling of all. Like, would you
Mhm.
say that an interest in those original German idealist figures is a common ground for all of you?
Um, I can't claim that because I have very little expertise in that area. So no, not three out of the four. I come to it less from a less of a philosophical background and more of a literary background. For me, the Romantics are primarily the English Romantic poets, and I have a smattering of understanding of their philosophical antecedents. But it's a common thread among three of the four of us for sure.
Reading a number of essays sort of from this circuit of people in one way or another, not all of them on Romanticon, I did get a pretty strong sense of a lot of the things that you all seem to be against. Among them, a heavily technologically mediated, life, especially a social or emotional life, that seems to be a real prominent villain in a lot of these essays. But I would say like both capitalism and Marxism seem to be you've rejected for the most part a sort of a staid bourgeois existence, but also a whimsically or insufficiently considered, artistic expression. I mean, it was harder to identify kind of what are you after? What do you want? What would be the better outcome? What would be the, even like mentioning the confessional, poets. I was just talking to Elijah about how that's effectively what the thing I'm about to put out is basically that. And
Mm.
I, had a conversation with another guy who came on to talk about being very much against self-referential poetry, which is definitely a thing I understand complaining about, and I definitely understand complaining about confessionalism as well. But I wonder what it is. What is the thing to be excited about, or to get behind, or to reach for? Or am I asking the wrong questions? I'm already revealing myself to have the wrong mindset?
Um, let me think about that. I said I'm against mere confessionalism. I think there is a kind of trivializing personal narrative.
Totally.
But I'm not against personal narrative as such, and nor am I against personal narrative that is somehow invested in the reality and quiddities of the everyday.
But that's
Um,
also okay if you are. I don't. Yeah. I mean, I wouldn't want you to. You don't need to soften anything for our sake. I just want to hear what you're. Yeah. What you're after. What you're excited about. What you
Yeah,
want.
well, you can't reject the autobiographical in general because then you have to get rid of Wordsworth.
Precisely. That's right. What are we for in general? It's an interesting question. I mean, I may answer indirectly, if
Sure.
only to say that maybe some uncertainty about that question is embodied in the form of the journal. Now, it's always been our plan to have both print journal and an online journal. And so far, the print journal remains elusive, though it remains on the horizon. The horizon seems to recede before us, strangely, but I'm confident that somehow we'll find traction in our boots and actually begin approaching it. But I say this because the print journal is supposed to have poetry and fiction. Um,
Hmm.
we felt
Okay.
that poetry and fiction didn't suit the medium of Substack, which I continue to think is largely true, though I have read good poetry online on Substack, and I have read good fiction on Substack, but nonetheless, they don't seem to inherently suit the medium. The medium lends itself to the essayistic and the polemical, which is to say that it orients itself or lends itself to the critical.
Hmm.
And so there may be a kind of drift from form into content where the polemical affordance of the medium has led to a polemical focus in the essays.
Sure.
But all of which is say I don't know what would be kinds of writing, literary writing, fiction and poetry, let alone social visions that we would embrace. I think so far it's sufficient. I think it's sufficient to give voice to complaint. I think a sense of dissatisfaction with the present. I mean, if Romanticon at the moment is largely an act of clearing the ground, that's a task that we could be at for some time. I hope we won't be at it infinitely or indefinitely.
And that's a way to begin to cultivate a community of people who have had similar frustrations or antipathies, and you're sort of giving voice to that, and so calling attention to this place for having a conversation.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
I'm
Yeah, I mean,
curious, are oh sorry.
go
I
ahead.
was
Go
going to
ahead.
ask, are there any novels and poets or novelists and poets writing today who you would say embody the spirit or who are the are an example of or are exemplars of what new romanticism or romanticon wants?
There are writers writing today. We would hope that there might be more younger writers writing today who embody the spirit, and I think there are some that we seen on Substack. Someone who comes to mind, who I was thinking about a moment ago, is probably the closest embodiment to a positive literary romantic vision that his essay is not critical. Will Diana, of whom we published a very interesting autobiographical essay in the magazine, is also a fiction writer and poet and translator of Rimbaud, though at least some of his translations I think are pseudo translations. They're sort of Ossian like forgeries or pseudo Rimbaud. He's quite interesting, though. The first person that comes to mind is A.F. Moritz, from whom
Hmm.
we looked at an essay. He's in his 70s, still writing. He's certainly someone who embodies what I would think to be a romantic spirit, and one that is critical of the contemporary, critical of the technological age in ways that I'm sympathetic with. I think there's a nebulous undergrowth of younger writers cropping up right now who may or may not be romantic by self-description, but find some sort of home for themselves in Romanticon. As I've named one of them by name, Will Diana.
How would
I'm
you
going to.
characterize the writing of his that most fulfills your hopeful vision?
He's written an essay about wandering in the woods with a 22 rifle as a young man, and it wonderfully combines solitude, nature, reverie with the capacity to inflict violence that I guess is maybe not always foregrounded in Wordsworth, but certainly present in a poem like Nutting and others. So there's a kind of element of risk in the persona. That's a piece that stands out to me. Embodies qualities of reflectiveness and an element of danger that I think is important to the romantic temperament as I would like to see it. It's a prose piece, but it's in a kind of it's a prose that maybe shares some of the meditative qualities of Wordsworthian blank verse. It wanders in a nice way.
I
Sure.
think
Yeah, I think I was just going to say. I thought the Matthew Gasta essay, Elijah, that you shared, that
Mm.
was a sort of a provocation or a challenge to the new romantics to say, actually, living like a romantic is really dangerous, and there's a reason they died young.
Right, right. That's right.
Yeah.
Or
Well,
Auden has that bitter line in the Shield of Achilles, though it's about men being executed by torture. He says they died as men before their bodies died, and
Yeah,
unfortunately, one could extrapolate from that. There's something similar to that in terms of romantic poets outliving their gift. They died as poets before their bodies died. That's the alternative possibility to
right.
dying young,
The
unfortunately.
ones who didn't die young. Yeah.
yeah.
Exactly. Though my original romantic heroes, I'm trained, quote unquote, my academic training is as a modernist, sort of, or in the romantics among the modernists, Yeats and D.H. Lawrence, and to a lesser extent Stevens. But Stevens
Hmm.
and Yeats certainly are good exemplars of poets who cultivated their gift to the end, and in fact became
Yeah.
ever more strenuous and forbidding.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, well, I think it's worth mentioning that you're also the editor-in-chief at Literary Imagination, and there
Hmm.
you do get a chance to publish fiction and poetry. So does your agenda at Romanticon, does it sort of bleed over into your decisions about what to publish in Literary Imagination?
No, but let me think for a moment to give a more considered answer. Well, there have been instances where I've had essays submitted to one journal that seemed more appropriate to the other. I can think of a particular instance in which I tried to redirect an essay that was sent to me for consideration as literary imagination editor that I felt was better suited to a journal like Romanticon. We've as yet not succeeded in placing it for Romanticon.
There's still hope.
A very learned and imaginative essay that somehow was beyond the pale of the strict scholarly rigor that we do try to somewhat insist on in literary imagination. No, I think that they're different. I mean, as an editor of literary imagination, I'm not beholden to and I'm not promoting any particular aesthetic agenda. Now, you could say that a kind of aesthetic agenda might be implied by the title of the journal. It's a strange title in a way, literary imagination, which seems, I guess, to mean something like imaginative literature. I mean, sometimes imaginative literature is used as a term of differentiation, from, I don't know, belles lettres of other kinds, or, writing
Or
that
like
is
realist
no,
literature or naturalist literature.
Or journalism.
no, not even. I think sometimes you'll find it, if you look back a few decades, you'll find English professors saying that what they study, their field of study is imaginative literature, which would include realism and naturalism, imaginative literature as opposed to maybe history writing or I guess some kinds of philosophy or a science manual, something like that. So I think imaginative literature is a kind of pleonasm. It just seems to mean literature. Literary imagination, I guess the title suggests a slightly different focus, though I tend not to worry about that too much.
Do you have a mandate from LCW?
Only the tacit one that I'm to publish essays that bear out ALSEW's mandate,
How would
which
you
is
describe
stated in
that?
some fashion on its website. I think that it's a matter of public record that ALSEW was founded partly out of reaction
Spite,
to
yeah.
to the MLA, which was felt to have abandoned literature for a variety of theoretical obsessions, and had maybe adopted a kind of anti-literary bent. And I think that kind of anti-literary animus is still present in the academy.
Totally.
Um, I share some of the I share some of the antipathies, but I'm concerned not to have literary imagination be a solely reactive project. And I think it would be a mistake to see literary imagination as a journal that forbids various kinds of theoretical speculation or theoretical inquiry. I think that could end up being stultifying.
But you're
I
mostly
think that my
publishing.
only criterion is that literature, the literary imagination, somehow be at the center of any submitted piece. That some esteem for literature, esteem for the imagination, has to be central. I think there has to be kind of implicitly appreciative or celebratory or adventurous dimension to anything we publish. But yeah, I'm not seeking to promote a kind of neo-romanticism or anything like that in my
Sure.
editorship.
Yeah, the Alicia Stallings' old joke about the LCW is that it was the MLA for people who like to read books. So I can imagine that, but specifically, you
Right.
do publish chiefly, and it seems like the focus is chiefly scholarly essays, not bloodless scholarly essays, but sort of rigorous scholarly essays in literary imagination. To the extent to which you publish poetry and fiction, do you have tastes? Do you have things you like? Do you have preferences? Or things you despise, things you recoil from?
Here I may be reluctant to lay my cards on the table. There are kind of a certain. This might be something better inferred from reading the magazine than
Okay.
me stating anything.
You could also,
I don't
it's
have
not a bad
any.
way to discourage people from sending stuff that you don't want to read. No more cat poems, no more grandmother poems.
I mean, as a reader of Christopher Smart, and Thomas Gray,
Okay,
I know
more cat
there
poems.
are
You
great
heard it
cat
here.
poems,
More
and
cat poems.
not to mention T.S. Eliot. I'm
Yeah.
told has a book-length collection of wonderful cat poems.
That's right.
So
Send in
yeah,
your best imitations of Old Possum's book of.
The new romanticism needs more cat poems.
There you go.
reason not the need. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, do I have I have no resistances on subject matter or anything like that.
What experience do you want to have when you read a poem or a story or whatever? What do you want it to do to you?
Hmm. Resist the imagination almost successfully, but its particular mode of resistance has to involve putting its hooks into you sonically and texturally. My first great poetic love was probably Hopkins, and you can't have Hopkins all the time. That's too much, but some underlying sense that there has to be a kind of there has to be some kind of grit in the language. That's something very important to me.
That's no, but that
Um,
that is clarifying.
I'd say
That's a place on a
sound.
spectrum. Yeah.
Yeah, sound is very important to me. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to be. I've never defined myself as a formalist or a neo-formalist, but some sense of form, you know, um, whether it's organic form or it's an ad hoc form or it's even a poem in free verse, but has some underlying sense, that goes to the pentameter. That's very important to me. The body of the poem is as important as the spirit of the poem. Um,
Setting any politics aside, do you see new romanticism being sort of in league with a push for a more traditional or conservative aesthetics?
what would you have in mind?
Like for example, using meter and rhyme. I mean, I know you said you're not you don't hold yourself to meter and rhyme, or you don't think the poems have to have it, but it seems like you're looking for some more of that traditional structure. And I wonder if that also applies to um, more traditional ways of approaching fiction or approaching even visual art or music or what have you.
Hmm. I find it strange to describe meter and rhyme as conservative. I mean, I know that's been a that's been a belief.
Well, no, and
Um,
I think it's a complete fallacy to
it's another
equate writing in
fallacy.
meter and rhyme with any political persuasion. But I think it is useful to talk about aesthetic conservatism. Like I would consider myself pretty aesthetically conservative, even though I'm not politically
mm,
conservative at all. And so
mhm,
I'm wondering if that's part of maybe the mission or the agenda.
Traditional techniques.
mm.
Yeah, or even because you were talking about beauty and beauty in reaction to modernity, and is does beauty in your mind have something to do with uh, sort of the timeless sense of beauty that has been and had been championed, in some form up until sort of the the crusade against beauty that you get with certain forms of modernism and postmodernism.
Well, Yeats is always of the opinion that a beautiful woman's face existed before the world was made. It doesn't get more timeless than that. In that sense, I'll go with Yeats and timeless beauty. I know that's not exactly what you mean, but yeah, it's interesting. Okay, traditional techniques. I mean, what first comes to mind actually is not not poetry, but movies. I mean, just the film grain, practical in-camera effects, getting actors on location and making them do things in real physical space. And I guess all of those um, qualities would in today's filmmaking be called very traditional. But if you look at a good movie from the 1970s, and for some reason an image comes to my mind of McCabe and Mrs. Miller, which is just wonderful film grain, all of that. That's sort of the visual analogs of that sonic texture that I like so much in a poem. I think that art in any kind, of any kind, any medium has to include elements that are not fully understood, that don't lie fully within the artist's grasp, and that encompasses a variety of kinds of things not fully understood. One's inspiration, sort of attending to the biddings of one's own soul or whatever, demonic, daimonic influxes, maybe the recipient of, but also techniques, meters which themselves appeal to the properties of a particular language, which always extends somehow indefinitely beyond one's grasp, or in my movie analogy, when you're working with real actors in a real place, which has necessarily a strong element of the uncontrollable. I think all of that is very important, and to me, art is always some kind of negotiation between control and uncontrol, or the imposition of form, I suppose. Though I guess it'd be more romantic to speak of discovery of form rather than imposition of form. Discovery of form within the material, that Michelangelo image, or imposition of form, I suppose, on a material, but a material that remains resistant in some way. So I think the interest of traditional form, I I just sort of reject the term conservative, not because of its political associations, um, which I maybe have less misgiving about, but it just doesn't seem to describe what one is doing with traditional form. It's not about. I mean, I suppose it depends how you think about conserving, but to me, it's really the carrying over, okay, but also the
Well, it seems like you're trying to conserve certain things that are innately human from, the technopolis, like a techno apocalypse.
sure, sure, yeah, that's fair. Yes, you remind me of a late interview with Jeffrey Hill, and I think the Oxford undergraduate student magazine, where he spoke of a poem as a stronghold in imagination, and that carries much the same sense of you're sort of holding terrain. And I can't help but think that somehow that image of the stronghold, somehow the diagram of the structure of the fortress evokes something of the structure of a poem. So I think that that's a reasonable way, maybe a reasonable way of thinking about things.
So
Um,
is there a political slant to all this? I mean, the LCW tends to skew conservative, though that may be as much the institution. You see, like that maybe the institution more than it is necessarily the members by percentage. But is there a political skew to this thing you're doing?
we should distinguish. I thought you were talking about a politics of Romanticon,
Well, but I
where at
mean,
least
but
one, or at least
or
one member of the four is a committed communist, and
right,
you
yeah,
know,
yeah.
another is on the record, championing Trump in the recent election. So we have both a Trump voter, a Trump champion, and a communist. So that's our political spectrum. ALCW, I don't regard ALCW as having a politics. I don't regard Literary Imagination as having any sort of politics.
Okay.
Certainly not. And if to the extent that ALCW had a politics, I would probably characterize it more as a kind of liberalism than a conservatism. And I suspect the majority of ALCW's members are liberals of some persuasion, would describe themselves as such. There's certainly a significant number who might call themselves conservatives. But I no, I think that it's very important to me that in fact both journals that I work on be ecumenical politically. And it's very important to me that literary imagination not be politically prescriptive in any way.
I mean, part of, as you suggested, part of the success and even the purpose of Romanticon is to begin and to encourage a conversation, kind of inviting people in who may have similar sympathies, who may have interests or curiosities about some of these questions, and cultivate a dialogue among this maybe growing nucleus of writers, thinkers, etc. Reading it as a dumb guy from outside, it definitely has to some in some ways more than others has a little bit the feel of a conversation I'm eavesdropping on. Do clearly part of, in order to like have any kind of successful movement or even just literary scene, you need to have internal conversations, and maybe those are not impenetrable, but they are mostly focused on people who are already part of that dialogue. Are there things you would want people outside of that hardcore to know or hear, or is there something you would like to say to people who may not already be initiates?
Initiates into the Eleusinian mysteries of Romanticon. Are you referring to conversations that are internal to the pages of the journal, or conversations that are somehow behind the scenes among the editors?
Oh, no, I mean, clearly you're going to have conversations that are private, but I mean, even as a publication, it does seem like it's not forbidding. I mean, the Moritz essay I found, as I said to you, pretty opaque from basically the first, I mean, the first sentence makes this sort of like emphatic claim that I thought like, wow, poetry always involves emotion toward reality on every level. I
Yeah.
don't even necessarily disagree with that. I just think like, whoa, we've got an always and an every there in the first go. And
Well, you know,
I need to think about this.
go big or go home, right?
That's fine. Yeah, sure, sure, sure. But it does seem like there's some of the conversation is meant for people who are already part of it, and but to me that's totally healthy. That's totally normal, and it also kind of encourages people who maybe have an inkling or have a sympathy or have a frustration in common. That's part of how you bring people in. But I even get the feeling talking to you that we're asking the wrong questions, and that I want to ask like, well, what would be if I could offer an opportunity for you to speak to I mean, I don't think it's a dumb audience. I think it's a smart audience that's not always an expert audience. And I'm kind of curious, like what should we be hearing or thinking or knowing if we are not already sufficiently learned to, for the purposes of participating at the highest level? What is it that we had that it can offer for the profanum or profanus, whatever, however you say it?
I don't know. I don't know if it's a function of learning. I don't know. I mean, some of our essays are fairly learned, I guess. Though, I mean, they run the gamut.
Yours more than Galuzzo's, I would say.
Oh, I don't know. I don't think that's true. I don't think
Well, I
that's
mean,
true.
at least
But
the one I read was not. I mean, his essay was seemed like it was aimed at a little bit more of a general audience.
I see what you mean. Yeah. Well, he's a scholar. He's written a range of things for us as well. I don't know. I think that I mean, one thing I might say, and this might have given me some misgiving in accepting your invitation. I don't
Sure.
know. I don't know that as editor of Romanticon, I feel that it's my mission to promulgate a neo-romanticism. I mean, for me, Romanticon is for those for whom the romantic is a problem. It's for those who are interested in the possibility of a romanticism, or those who think that romanticism raises questions that they are beset by in some way. I guess one thing I might say is that to look for something doctrinal, to look for a positive romantic program might really and truly be the wrong question. I think that it really is a matter of opening yourself to these writers and their questions and their concerns to the extent that they speak to you. The claim of the journal is that the romantic questions have somehow come back to the fore, that whatever delirium we're speaking out of will find a receptive audience who might be in a similar delirium and might be similarly unable to articulate what is besetting them except for the presence of these strange essays we're publishing. Yeah, I think it's hard to be more concrete.
Well,
It might defeat the
Well,
I'm
purpose more,
all for
or if I might say
not
one
giving a
further thing, I might
program.
say,
I'm all for
let me say one
not
further.
saying do this and do that,
No,
but
no,
I
no.
would
Let me say
love
one
to
further thing. Let
hear.
me say one further
Yeah,
thing, which is
please.
the metaphor of the initiate. The initiate undergoes the ritual and is then admitted into the inner sanctum as a member of the cult. That to me seems the wrong metaphor. I don't think there is an internal inner sanctum or a set of doctrines or secret teachings that one is admitted to after having undergone the ritual. I think one induces romanticism in oneself through reading some of our essays, through reading romantic poems, letting them speak to you to the extent that they speak to you.
well, it seems like if there is a doctrine, it's a negative doctrine, right? It's like what you can all agree on that's bad is,
Mhm.
a certain technical zeitgeist which is imposing itself upon us, and that Romanticon is decidedly anti that. But then, in terms of positively what to do about it, really, it's more of a suggestion. And the suggestion is return to the romantics, return to the romantic materials and the romantic spirit, in whatever way that makes sense for you, which is intuitive and individualist, which is very much in the romantic spirit. I'm curious because Romanticon is not, um, it's not isolated. It's not like the sole representative of New Romanticism. I'm wondering what Romanticon's relationship is to figures like Ted Gioia or Ross Barkin at Metropolitan Review or other people and places, venues that I've seen that talk about New Romanticism.
Yeah, I've read less of Ted Gioia than I should, so I will leave him to the side. Yeah, Barkin, interesting figure. He wrote a viral essay about a new romanticism around the time we got going, and I think Matt's essay that you had me read, which I had read before, but the Wisdom of Crowds essay is partly responding to Ross's essay. Yeah, I think that for Ross Barkin, Romanticism is less associated with 18th century and 19th century England, though Blake, I gather, is a figure of some importance for him. I think Ross's Romanticism is okay, more American, in part more identified with vitalism. He tends to write about vitalism and interestingly connects uh, his sense of the romantic through vitalism to athleticism. He's interested in um, contemporary American sports. I think especially baseball. Rather staid sport from a vitalist standpoint, but a sport nonetheless. Um, but also, I think there's another romantic strain in Ross's writing, which is sort of the Fitzgerald strain. Like it's the American dreamers um, scrabbling their way up toward the big time, chasing illusions. I mean, there's elements of Fitzgerald in this, and also of Stephen Crane, with his famous man chasing a ball of gold in the sky. She finds and discovers it's not gold, but doesn't abandon the quest. I think that sense of American questing after illusions is part of Ross's romanticism, and something that we've done less of in Romanticon, but I would like to see more of it. I think more ought to be said for a romanticism of the city, and Ross writes a kind of romanticism of the city. So, um,
We've
yeah,
got Hart Crane.
yeah, or Hart Crane, right? Exactly. Yeah, we have not had anything on Hart Crane yet, but we should. Um, exactly, exactly.
Well, it's interesting hearing you speak. It's the first time I've ever thought that maybe there's a romantic dimension to capitalism. I think of
Hmm.
romanticism as being pretty anti-capitalism, but I mean, romanticism and capitalism are both in certain interpretations about ceaseless striving. So it's an interesting parallel.
Well, I would say that Emerson certainly is a kind of capitalist. Emerson is certainly a kind of romantic, and Wallace Stevens is certainly a kind of romantic and certainly a kind of a capitalist. So no, I think that's certainly right. I mean, Stevens has sort of eccentric ideas, and money is a metaphor and that sort of thing. And the links um, are various. I, I think Hart Crane also very much thought of American industry, American ingenuity, American business as forms of romantic Promethean striving. I think it's not a strange connection at all. I would say this does mark a significant cleavage among the Romanticon editors. Anthony is explicitly anti-capitalist and anti-Promethean. Prometheus does not name a great hero for him. Um, but no, I think that it's something that we've talked about internally. Romanticism has many ambivalences, and it stands to reason that a champion of one flavor or strand of romanticism would not only not adhere to, but be repulsed by another strand, without the latter not being romantic.
Is there
You suggest that you have a little bit more of a conservative leaning yourself. Is there? I mean, it's the podcast is funny because the hosts are basically all. Well, I won't speak for everybody, but I'm a dumb lefty atheist. But like a sizable percentage of the listeners are conservatives and Christians as well, with some overlap and some, heavy overlap between those two categories. A perennial question that I think we have a lot of productive disagreement about is whether there's a valuable element of moral instruction or moral improvement to be found in literature. And I'm curious. I mean, you seem very uh, reluctant to commit to claims publicly, which again makes me think I'm asking the wrong questions. But I'm curious if this is if you see your project as one of, maybe not just a like an improvement of the spirit of the age, but also are you aiming for kind of larger cultural moral improvement or individual moral improvement? Is this conservative better? Is this a call to traditional morals or to something else? I don't know.
I've only ever voted for Democrats or third party leftist weirdos. I only meant to say that I don't share the allergy to the term conservative and refuse to be browbeaten
Sure, sure, sure.
by by the term.
Yeah,
There are things worth conserving and so on. And to trot out the old saw, many of my best friends are conservatives.
yeah.
Um, I think that there's a kind of, I'm interested in certainly moral improvement, though it might not look like moral improvement to everyone. I mean, we ran an essay that I greatly treasure about Abel Ferrara's Bad Lieutenant as a kind of saint's life, as a kind of holy sinner, holy fool. I recommend that essay very highly. Yeah, I mean, to make room, at least in imagination, for the thoroughly depraved, that would be a kind of moral renovation that I would like to like to bring about. No, I think we've been too timid as a society and too pearl clutching, I guess is the word to use. No, I think there needs to be a space for danger in art and danger in imagination.
Well,
Um,
I think even someone like Dostoevsky would agree, right? Like
of
you need to
course,
show the human being in the depths of depravity in order to, in order to truly find a way out. Or I mean, William Blake also in the Proverbs of Hell, you get the same idea of, touching the nadir in order to ascend to the apex.
precisely. Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I mean that would be a sufficient social renovation for my purposes.
I guess it's funny. Like there are a lot of the writers I know who devote the most attention to the most depraved behavior often do have a loud or a quiet moral agenda in their writing. But if you're talking about a renovation, suggesting that there's something in our art right now that doesn't allow for some kinds of possibility. I mean, I do think that there's a much commented on trend in, I guess you'd call it mainstream liberal art in the last 10 years that seems to operate by according to the assumption that to depict something without depicting immediate and clearly stated consequences is to endorse it,
Right.
which is, of course, like a deadly formula if you want to tell an interesting story.
Yeah. Well,
Yes, indeed.
it's like the Baudelaire method. You know, we need more Baudelaires, need more Blakes, right? Need more Dostoevskys, people who are willing to show how irrational is man, and and are not. Yeah, because I think it's true. There is a kind of almost neo-Victorianism prevalent now, where only you're only allowed to write about certain kinds of protagonists, or only from certain points of view if you are, you know, if you the author are, you know, of a certain demographic, and works are derided as immoral or problematic when they don't fulfill a certain expectation. So yeah, I think that it's reasonable to have a backlash against that, just as it's reasonable to have a backlash against AI and against
Sure, yeah.
hypercapitalism and technological plutocracy and all of that. So yeah,
So yeah, and that was, I think, an important early motive of Romanticon was that sort of backlash. And yeah, the neo-Victorian indeed, though. You're not the Victorianism of Rossetti or Swinburne, which might be what we really are in need of.
well,
Um,
we need an eminent Victorians about contemporary figures. You're like
Yeah,
a new
Elijah's
literary chief.
fantasy vision
Oh.
is instead of a new Romanticism, a new pre-Raphaelite movement.
well, I would sign on
That's
to
just,
that.
yeah, so something
I would
like
sign on
that.
to that. Yes, and add in William Morris, his wonderful
That
Defense of Guinevere and those great poems.
I was going to say, but
Um,
believe me, there's a heavy William Morris appreciation in Elijah's house. Yeah.
Good, good, good,
Boom.
good. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that's incredible stuff.
Yeah.
And
Well,
talk about just on the sense of form. I think form is something not at all constrictive, but somehow unleashing a kind of native vigor of the language. Morris's Terza Rima is really extraordinary.
well, and
Um,
I was thinking when you were talking about film and about going back to, you know, having real actors in real places affected by real elements, it seems like maybe the word that we're looking for here is not traditional or conservative, but analog, something like that. Like where you're wrestling
right,
with real life materials.
right, analog and by extension embodied. Yes, that seems right. Yes,
Is
analog.
Heidegger a big philosopher for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are Heideggerian themes in my writing, and I think in throughout the journal, not only in terms of thinking about technology and resistance to thinking about the world as standing reserve, but the emphasis on finitude and death, I think, is quite important, and something that I've often been twisting myself into knots about is how to think about the simultaneous romantic interest in transcendence and the romantic interest in finitude. These two elements seem linked in whatever I would want a neo-romanticism to be. And the metaphor I keep coming back to is sort of a silly one, but the neo-romantic wants transcendence, the soul to transcend itself, but somehow on its own steam, transcendence on the soul's own steam. It's spiritual self-transcendence or the transcendence of artistic accomplishment, but presuming finitude, the immortality and finitude as giving oneself a stake in life. So I think that might be a kind of
But only for the body.
Heideggerian disposition in the background.
But not, I mean, not for the soul, though. Isn't that part of your idea?
Yeah, I tend to think of the soul, right. I was saying the soul is something immortal. I tend to think of the soul. There's lines from Emerson's Self-Reliance that stick in my mind. The soul somehow participates in the primal energy that gave rise to the universe. The that primordial energy that returns to us in nature as among its manifestations. I wouldn't assert a belief in the individual immortality of the soul, but that the soul participates in something immortal.
You're talking about like an Atman. That's the kind of soul you believe in.
Something like that.
Because say you're starting to sound like Elijah on one of his acid trips, but which I gather have can supply a great deal of real insight. But because it does sound like when I hear you talk about the soul, and I remember that phrase, "the soul's own steam," on the in
Mm,
the essay of yours I just reread. What strikes me is that if there is an immortal soul present in your vision of man and the world, it it doesn't, I don't get the strong feeling that there is also a recognizable monotheistic God involved.
Not in my personal romanticism. They don't
Okay.
speak for
All
everyone.
right.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like you're maybe you're not an expert on German idealism, but it seems like it's related. You know, your personal spirituality is maybe parallel to um, something that Schelling might say, you know, drawing on Spinoza, or that Hegel might say, drawing on Spinoza. Um, yeah, I totally get that, and you know, of course, which influenced Coleridge and Emerson, which you know you're clearly versed in Coleridge and Emerson, so that definitely trickles through.
What would be a better question, Paul?
You're making me feel I've disappointed you, gentlemen.
No, 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 no. The feeling I get is that I've failed to engage you in the right way, or I failed to draw you out in the right way. I had a philosophy teacher once tell me that it was important not just to read a book with right understanding, but to read it with the right mood. And the
Mm.
odd feeling I have reading a lot of the essays that Elijah recommended, or that I found in Romanticon, or kind of in that circle, the feeling I often have is that I agree with so many of the assertions,
Mm.
but I feel myself still on the wrong side of it somehow. I feel myself still being disapproved of, but in tone, if not in substance. It just
Well,
makes me
tell me
wonder,
more
like,
about that. I'm interested to hear more about that. What are you disapproved of for?
I don't know. I guess my like having a wife and kids in a house in a small town for. I mean, honestly, what was funny to me, because of all the anti technology stuff in it, is that I much prefer to read while pacing around on my feet.
Mm.
And so what I like to do is print things out, and then I can carry them around in one hand, and I can underline them. And but the problem is that when I print out things from Substack, it slices an inch off the right side. So it's
Mm.
unreadable. So then I ended up reading all of these fucking things on my phone. so yeah, I felt like I was definitely not doing it, whatever it was, I was definitely not doing it right as I read these
Mm.
essays.
You know,
And
we've
it made me
uh,
think, like, yeah, there's something about I've got the wrong mood, or there's a je ne sais quoi that I'm missing that may not be so much the substance as the aura.
Well, I think one of the
you know,
central
we shouldn't.
angsts in romantic.
It's risky to to hint at any forthcoming projects because there's many a slip between cup and lip. But there has been discussion of some kind of micro printed version of the magazine that would not be exactly the on the horizon, full print version, but which might involve some individual essays being distributed in some kind of pamphlet form you'd be able to read
Okay, all
on your
right,
walks and not
that
have
would
to pull
help.
up on
That
your
would
phone.
certainly help. Yeah.
Um, well, that's you say that. I mean, my wife was putting my son to bed downstairs as we speak, and I live in a small
Okay.
town, so I hope you don't feel too disapproved of. Though I do
All
only
right.
have a single child, and I guess I'm being a derelict father, forcing my wife into parental duties while I'm off having fun talking about romanticism and so on. But no, you certainly shouldn't feel disapproved of. And in fact, one of our early themes was a kind of anti-natalism. It was in fact the theme of my debut essay for romanticism. So no, we want our vitality to flow in various channels. I don't want to be
All
too
right.
graphic here, but generating
Sure.
is something we all approve of, and at least one of us practices.
All
Well,
right.
there's the active romantic and the contemplative romantic, right? And I think Romanticon probably consists largely of contemplative romantics, and even Romanticon itself is it makes concessions to modernity by being a Substack, right? And that feels to me like one
Sure.
of the central angsts of the journal and of New
Mm-hmm.
Romanticism generally is that it's largely a digital phenomenon. And no,
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly not the first to suggest this. I think Gasta talks about this as well.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's interesting because a lot of what you're fighting against, you're also encouraging by having people spend more time on the internet.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean the move to print certainly makes sense, and it feels like that's the logical trajectory of the journal given its ethos.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's the question. We read an essay recently by Udith Demetagoda, who's a modernist by academic training. He's edited a book on Wyndham Lewis. whom he also, I guess, now sees as a kind of romantic, of a very
Well,
strange kind.
that's
But he
dangerous.
raises the question, it's absurd, of a vitalist, this kind of
Yeah.
vitalism he sees in
Well,
so
vorticism for sure.
there, of
Yeah.
course. Yeah, Udith, takes a kind of anti-technological stance, and part of that essay is an Illulian critique of the Unabomber, whom he takes to be too literal in his reading of technology and not regressing from technology to technique. Okay, this is kind of like the Heideggerian, Illulian sort of substrate, but the notion being, I guess, at least in Udith's presentation, that one could reorient one's attitude towards technology, that one could use technology without being beholden to it or totally subservient to the rule of technique, which for Ellul is the rule of efficiency. I think that's maybe possible. I think that it might be possible to retrain our modes of online reading, that it might be possible to cultivate a more contemplative, less hot takey stance for online writing, which I think we are partly doing on Romanticon. Though doing that, I mean, we are always in some negotiation with the affordances of the platform. And one of the major ones is simply the churn. You have to keep putting stuff out there. I think the stuff we're putting out there is good. But yeah, that constantly having to be spinning the wheel of putting out content. I think that's one difficult aspect of the internet that we have to negotiate. I think that it's a roundabout way of saying, I think that the internal form of the pieces that we're publishing, in many cases, if not most cases, successfully militates against bad habits of internet reading. But there is something about the format of a twice weekly Substack publication that does force you into a certain kind of internet mentality. And of course, we do also face the practical necessity of growing our subscriber base and growing our paid subscriber base, because we do pay writers a small fee. The money has to come from somewhere. So those are certainly challenges.
Is there a goal in mind of like a certain sort of critical mass of online popularity that you would like to reach, or is it just endless?
Hmm.
Like capitalism, right? You grow every quarter is growth, right?
Right.
Well, we'd like, not achieved anything remotely approaching this, but we would like the magazine to be economically self-sufficient. We pay writers. We want to continue paying writers. We pay them much less than we would like to, but we pay them something. We think that's important. We do also pay our staff a very small amount, less than we'd like to, but we do pay something. I don't think that we envision any world in which the fees we pay writers or the amount we pay staff would be astronomical figures. We're not aiming for, Vanity Fair circa 1990 or something. So I don't think we need infinite growth. And I think we'd be reluctant to chase infinite growth if it were at the price of watering down our content, either in its subject matter or its form. So there may be some internal limits to how large we can grow, or certainly into how fast we can grow. But by the same token, we don't fear publicity. We want to get as big as we can. We want to be self-sufficient if possible. But no, do we have a number we're chasing? No, we don't have a number we're chasing. Early signs have been encouraging. We've had a couple big pieces that have been picked up by others. Not always the pieces we would have expected. We're very happy with everything we put out. That you never know exactly what's going to strike a chord, and those have been buoys for us. It's always nice when that happens.
Elijah, I'm curious because I feel like one of your hobby horses for at least the first year or two of Versecraft was romanticism as a bête noire. I mean, you seem to be very, very anti-romantic, very much to think that the romantic impulse was to blame for a lot of the ills of modernity. So I'm curious about your interest in this group, and it does seem like there's to some extent any contrarian spirit can begin to find allies and other contrarian spirits depending on, like it may be that your anti-romanticism and their romanticism are both enemies of the same bigger enemy. But maybe again, I was not an English major, so I always feel like I'm a few steps behind in these kind of discussions.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'll say is that I came to what might be called an anti-romantic or a suspicious of romantic stance from being a romantic, for sure. And I think that that romantic core has always been part of me, always will be part of me. And I think that, all of the reading that I did as I was thinking through the pitfalls or the toxicities, potential toxicities of romanticism, it comes out of a real passionate interest in the phenomenon of the romantic spirit, like what that is and why it has such a powerful pull, and why does it seem so cool but it has such questionable effects.
Mhm.
And so yeah, I think a lot of the things that Gazda talks about in his piece are misgivings that I've had. I personally am someone who believes that hyper emotionalism, a hyper focus on the self, is often hazardous. Um, Sacrificing reason and clarity in one's art, and justifying it through just pure feeling or intuition, I think can often lead down to down incoherent paths, or down even immoral paths. But also, I think, and so even as someone who's maybe on the other side of the fence sometimes, I think that if you see a lot of people talking about romanticism, then you say, oh, well, what's happening? Like, why are all those people so interested in this thing? And do they have the same, what is their conception of it, and how does that conception relate to mine? Are they similar? Are they seeing something that I'm not seeing, or are they emphasizing something that I don't consider central to my conception of romanticism? But also beyond that, I think that at the time that I found Romanticon and the New Romantics on Substack, I'd come out, and I've talked about this on Versecraft too. It came at an interesting time, which I guess is still this time, where I've come more and more to acknowledge uh, the native essential romanticism of myself and my
Mhm.
own projects, despite misgivings, despite some anti-romantic uh, prescriptions and tendencies that I've embodied or that I've preached. I still hold to many of those things, but I think that, like in my essay, the Monumentalist Manifesto, or in the Iron Lyre, those, I wouldn't call those romantic documents, but I think that they are romantic in spirit, in the same way that, I could imagine Shelley writing something like that, like the Defense of Poetry. I think it's a similar drive to make art vital and ambitious again, to have art be passionate. And I think passion is complicated. I don't think that poetry or art should be overrun with passion, but I think a lot of what I see now in poetry or in fiction or wherever is a lack of true grit, a lack of true vitality, lack of ambition. And I think you have to have that fire. You have to pursue those things wholeheartedly. And you know, I'm totally with romanticism in believing that, a kind of hyper rationality which becomes an irrationality is a vice to be combated. A rationality which is dehumanizing, which pursues a bottom line or a utilitarian objective at all costs. I totally believe in that. Um, and it's interesting because I think maybe there's a version of romanticism which is kind of more in line with an ethos of Aristotelian moderation. Like, we need to stop being so excessive in this direction. We need to bring things back to be more balanced. And I am in
Mhm.
favor of that. I'm not in favor of swinging to the entire other direction and saying, well, no, we now all have to be ecstatic mystics in the field, and it doesn't matter what we say because it's all feeling and it doesn't matter. Um, so in and like romantics, I'm huge on the sublime, and that's always been a big thing that I pushed in my own work. It's what I love to see in the work of others. I think the sublime is probably what I am attracted to in art more than anything.
Mhm.
And that was definitely a romantic concern, but it's not an exclusively romantic concern. I mean, the ancients were very preoccupied with the sublime as well. So I think maybe insofar as classicism and romanticism intersect in maybe the spirit of Pindar or the spirit of Aeschylus,
Mm.
or the spirit of Euripides and the Bacchae, then yes, I'm totally on board. When it comes to romanticism as kind of a form of impossibly tragic Gnostic spirituality or sentimentality, then I think I'm a little bit more iffy. But
Mm.
as we've been talking about, and as people who talk about romanticism have always said, it's such a tricky term to define. You can't really define it. And so I would say, yes, there are some strands of romanticism which I'm wholly against, some which I'm suspicious of but willing to entertain, and others which maybe I'm totally on board with. I certainly think it's interesting to talk about romantic poetry and literature, and I do a lot of that on Versecraft. I think a lot more so now than I used to, because a lot of times romantic poets, whether they are acknowledge themselves as romantic or not, they're the ones who are wrestling with ideas the most interestingly. Even back in the day when I when I think I was trashing romanticism the most, I think the thing I said was that maybe the one invaluable thing that romanticism has brought to literature is a focus on internality,
Mhm.
um, and and so like that there's a focus on reflection and focus on meditation in poetry that you can certainly find in some of the English Renaissance poets, but you don't really get it to the same extent or the same degree until romanticism has been fully digested by the Western world. And then you
Mhm.
see that going into modernism. And I think a lot of the modern poets that I like most, you wouldn't necessarily characterize as out and out crazy romantics, but they
Mhm.
benefited from romanticism in some way. Like
Who are we talking
if,
about?
well, like a huge influence on me has been Ivor Winters,
Mm.
and the ilk, the students of Ivor Winters, Stanford School. And Winters has a really interesting story because I think very much like me, he had a romantic soul and was trying to fight it
Mm.
for decades
Extraordinary animus
after.
against Romanticism, but was it Winters? Winters has some remark about Hart Crane, if I'm not mistaken, something to the effect of, "If I had the opportunity, I would make the journey of Odysseus down to the underworld for one more hour's conversation with Hart Crane on the subject of poetry," something like that.
Yeah,
Um,
he loved Hart Crane.
yeah.
He would rail against Yeats in class and shoot down anyone who praised him, but then he would sometimes read Yeats in his office.
Mm.
Um, he had a very complex relationship to it, and it
Mm.
came out of. I mean, he started as one of the most brilliant imagists. He was
Mm.
sort of a latter day imagist, and wrote critical essays about imagism. He was a practicing imagist,
Yeah.
and there's a sense in which imagism is a tributary of romanticism. Yeah, and I think even when he abandoned that and
Frank
focused,
Kermode's reading of Imagism. Yeah.
yeah, well, I
And
mean,
Norm Duncan has the whole book.
I'm the
Yeah.
type
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
obnoxious person who will say that modernism is just avant-garde romanticism. But yeah, I think that image the imagist focus on precision and on the
Mm.
concrete and on the particular is something that he never abandoned, even as he embraced a more Augustan
Mm.
classical sense of what poetry was supposed to be. But yeah, I think he and his students, people like Edgar Bowers,
Mm.
who, his Edgar Bowers' favorite poet was Paul Valéry, who, is a very particular kind of romantic. Paul Valéry too. Paul Valéry is a perfect example of someone who had like a really weird relationship with romanticism, who considered himself this extremely rigorous classicist, but at the same time was completely Mallarmean in some ways, and Mallarmé, I think in some interpretations could be considered the apex of romanticism. So yeah,
Yeah, in this
it's
day and
all
age, Paul Valéry with his sprawling essays on the poetic principle and so on would be a Substacker in his spare time.
yeah. So there's so many strange conversations and intersections and influences, and it's impossible to untangle. But like, yeah, I think the lyric poets that I value most from the 20th century, people like Edgar Bowers, people
Mm.
like Richard Wilbur, even E.A.
Mm.
Robinson, they're not romantics in the way that Jeffers is a romantic or Hart Crane is a romantic, or even the way that Stevens is a romantic. But the sense of internality and meditation, I think, couldn't
Mm.
have happened without the romantics. And I think that if you
Mm.
look at pre-romantic lyric poetry, some of it stands out, but a lot of it is so repetitive and boring. It's like Petrarchanism over and over and over again. I mean, you can even say Petrarchanism is a kind of romanticism, but it lacks a certain internal, individual, personal dive into the soul that you really only get, well, I mean, there are exceptions, but you mainly only get post-romanticism. And I think that that is a really valuable contribution. So yeah, that's one example of how I am pro-romantic. But yeah, it's so complicated. Like, take Euripides. You could read Euripides as a romantic in the Bacchae. You could also read him as being like the most anti-romantic person ever. Portraying Dionysian romanticism as a total horror story.
You find
But
that internal meditative quality in those guys, Bowers and Robinson and Winters. That's interesting. It's not who I would have thought of. And Robinson, I guess, has that. He has that whole Arthurian series, right? I mean, he has a kind of quest
yeah, yeah,
romantic
yeah,
side of him.
and so some of those are more successful than others, but the most
Mm,
successful is Lancelot, I think.
mm,
And Lancelot is fascinating because it's like it's a pre-Raphaelite setting, like a sort of Tennysonian setting, but the characters, they are described and they talk like they're out of a Henry James novel, right? And so like that's internality all the way,
right,
right? And
right, right, right.
and Henry James is not someone I would characterize again as like a dashing, dangerous romantic, a Byronic type. But again, couldn't have Henry James without romanticism because
No.
there's that dive into people's motivations, into the self, into phenomenology, and yeah, we need that.
No, quite so, quite so.
I'm completely with you in believing that poetry should connect us to the real as much as
Hmm.
possible, and that is actually, to the extent that I believe poetry should be moral, it's grounded in that. It's
Mm,
in trying to reveal reality as it is, as
hmm,
much as possible, and poetry becomes immoral when reality becomes falsified. And so I
hmm,
think that in the worse romantic writing, reality does become falsified. Reality becomes sacrificed to the whimsy of the imagination, or to the whimsy of certain emotional flight, um, or just pure speculation. But yeah, I think that the thirst for transcendence is maybe what you're gravitating toward, and that,
precisely.
I mean, that's reality. That's part of what it means to be human, and I think one of the most central parts of being human. And so to address that is incredibly important for poetry to be able to do, and to shy away from that, if romanticism means reinstating a focus on the human spiritual drive to the transcendent, I think that, again, I'm all for that. I think as with
I
my
think it.
problem
I
with
think it
so
has to
much.
be some kind of transcendence within the real. I think Romanticism does want to be a lived reality, which is where it runs into difficulties. But I think it can't be solely pursuing one's satisfactions beyond this world. I think part of the motive to confront reality stems from a wish to transfigure, transform this world. I think that is an important part of the Romantic, but it's as
Or
noble in its defeat as in its triumphs, and sometimes as troubling in its triumphs.
Well, then this is one thing that's so fascinating about the sublime, is because the sublime is an encounter with the transcendent in this reality,
Hmm.
like in this moment, in this flesh and blood existence. Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself, but I think that when romanticism sort of succumbs to its dreams, or starts to believe in its dreams more than reality, I have a problem. But when the writing is about the search for transcendence, or the encountering of true earth-shaking sublimity in the world, I am very interested in that, as long as the response to that is something that I can credit.
Okay, that may be helpful. That may be clarifying for me at least, because I think that's where I have a strong allergy to moralizing art, even very subtly, brilliantly moralizing art. But I also just don't have much truck with the sublime or
Mm.
transcendence. I think that's where I'm with you in that I think that poetry, I wouldn't say poetry is immoral when it departs from the real or when it falsifies the real, but I would say it fails. It fails to provide sincere pleasure and recognition.
But
Who are your guys,
sometimes it
Patrick?
can fail seductively.
Who are the guys that you like,
The
or
guys that I
gals?
like, I love
Yeah,
Yeats. I mean,
who are your
Yeats
poets?
is Yeats a romantic? I don't know. I love Yeats. I mean, I think probably like the person I just did a whole episode. The person I've returned to the most is Shakespeare, but I love E.A. Robinson. Like, Jesus. I mean, he's also like, he's incredibly internal and psychological, even in his short lyrics. You know, that's The Mill, that's Miniver Cheevy, that's Mystery Flood's Party, that's Aunt Imogen, that's what's the butcher whose wife dies? I forget the name of
Reuben.
Reuben, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so there, I mean, that's him all over. I have Auden right here. I love Auden, even when he's being real Christian. I mean, I don't love all of that, but much of him. I'm a huge admirer of Donald Justice. I read a lot of, I guess he's not a romantic. I do go back a lot to Horace. I
Right.
have a sweet tooth for Larkin and Hausman, but I don't read
Mm,
them for pleasure anymore because I have too much of
mm,
a sweet tooth for them.
mm,
I'm enjoying some of Leah Party. I When he gets real wind in his sails about the greatness of the past or the inexpressible extremity of his passion for this woman, I start to feel myself rolling my eyes a little bit, which I did similarly in like Galuzzo's essay. I thought like his account of the shittiness of online dating was totally credible and moving. But when he started to wax enthusiastic about his new sexual passion for Grace, the auburn-haired waif, I thought like, come on, man, this is private talk. Like, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what my. I mean, again, I like a lot of Blake. I don't like a lot of Blake. I like some Blake, but I don't know. This is. I always feel to one side of these kind of conversations, and I do think that the sublime and the transcendent are maybe a part of that.
mm.
I'm deeply skeptical and resistant to those.
Yates is no stranger to talking up his beloved in verse.
Totally, he is. He
Yeah,
is. And
the would-be beloved.
sometimes it gets old, but so much is so great.
Yeah, I
I
think
think
Yates certainly comes out of romanticism. I mean Bloom,
I love that Galuzzo ended on that poem on the Wild Swans. I mean, it's one of
right?
my favorite poems. It was, well, yeah. So that was
Mm-hmm.
like that made me like the essay all the more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was the first half of my conversation with Paul Franz and Elijah Perseus Blumov. You can hear the second part on The Secret Show at sleerickets.substack.com. Put in your email address, and I will give you a week's access for free after that. It's really fucking cheap. It's $5 a month for a new episode every week, as well as access to the Substack chat where I post announcements, job listings, readings, various upcoming opportunities, and a bunch of chitter chatter between me and the listeners. And you also get the opportunity to submit poems for Listener Crit, a frank, anonymous critique offered by Cameron and me, or Alice and me, or somebody and me, or somebody not me. We shall find out. We've got a couple of really good Listener Crit episodes coming up soon. Check that out again at sleerickets.substack.com if you have some expendable income and would like to do a little extra to support the show, despite my inability to ask penetrating questions. Then you can sign up to be a founding member or motherfucker of the arts to give a little more every month and make a big difference. If you would really like to listen to The Secret Show but you cannot afford it, then write me a note at sleerickets@gmail.com and I will hook you up. Thank you all for listening, and with any luck, I will be speaking to you again very soon. Until then.